Imagine a child, barely old enough to understand the meaning of marriage, draped in silks that weighed heavier than her tiny frame. She stood in a cold candlelit hall, her eyes wide, her lips trembling, while men twice, even 3 times her age, looked upon her not as a child but as a political pawn, a prize, and perhaps even a possession. This was the brutal reality of queenship in the medieval world, where innocence was sacrificed on the altar of ambition, and a girl's body became the battlefield for men's power. Our story begins with one such queen. History remembers her not for the peace she brought, nor the battles she won, but for the horror that became her fate. She was forced into marriage with the very man who would one day execute her. A story soaked in betrayal, cruelty, and the darkest aspects of medieval politics, where love was never the plight, and survival was a fragile hope. But before we reach the bloody climax of her tale, we must understand the twisted world she was born into. Medieval Europe was a place where dynasties were built on fragile lines of succession. A royal child was not a child in the way we think today. She was currency, leverage, a treaty sealed in flesh and blood. For a king without heirs, a daughter was both a blessing and a curse, a jewel to be traded, but also a weak link, a reason for enemies to strike. And so, from the very moment this little girl was born, her life was no longer her own. She belonged to the crown, to the church, and to the men who circled the throne like wolves waiting for their chance to feed. As she grew, whispers of her future filled the court. Suitors from distant lands sent gifts, priests offered blessings, and kings made promises. But beneath all of it was the unspoken truth. She was a bargaining chip. Her body would seal alliances. Her womb would secure dynasties. Her suffering would be overlooked because it was the price of power. The church, always hungry for control, watched closely. It would sanctify these arrangements under the guise of holy matrimony, all while ensuring that obedience, chastity, and loyalty were demanded from her, but never from the men around her. In fact, priests themselves often participated in or endorsed these cruel bargains, declaring them God's will. When she was still a girl, some say barely past childhood, she was wed for the first time. Her husband was not chosen for love, nor for kindness, but for politics. He was her protector on paper, but in reality, he was another captor. Their union was paraded as a triumph of peace, but behind the scenes, the court buzzed with gossip. Would she bear children quickly? Would she secure the throne? Could she, still so young, even survive the violent realities of childbirth? The queen's body became a stage on which the kingdom's future was performed. Her nights were long, her days colder still, filled with the duties of royalty, but none of the freedoms of girlhood. Each smile she forced 4 ambassadors hid the terror she carried inside. She was trapped in a gilded cage, and every lock on the door was held by men with blood on their hands. And then came the man who would change everything, a figure who entered her life not as a lover nor as a savior, but as something far darker. He was ambitious, ruthless, and cunning, a man who clawed his way up the political ladder, who smiled at her in public, but whispered threats in the shadows. History would mark him as both her husband and her executioner, but at the time, he was simply another powerful man, another wolf circling the lamb, waiting for the chance to strike. It was not a marriage, but a sentence. She was forced to stand beside him to wear the crown at his side, while knowing in her heart that the very man who vowed to protect her was the one sharpening the blade that would one day end her life. This, then, is the story we uncover today. A story not of fairy tale queens and noble kings, but of betrayal, blood, and the darkest truths of medieval power. A story where innocence was devoured, and the crown became a noose. Before we go deeper into the horrors of her fate, let me remind you, if you are fascinated by the grim and shocking realities of medieval history, by the truths that textbooks often hide, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to Past of Medieval and join us as we step into the shadows of history, where power and cruelty often walked hand in hand. Because this is not just the tale of one queen. It is the tale of how an entire age treated its daughters of power, not as people, but as pawns. Before we can fully understand the horrific fate of the queen who was forced to marry her killer, we must look at how medieval Europe shaped royal daughters. From the moment of birth, the destiny of a princess was sealed, and rarely did it have anything to do with her own wishes. If a king fathered a son, the kingdom rejoiced. Bells rang, Feasts were held, and the future seemed secure. But if the child was a daughter, the celebration was always tinged with unease. She was valuable, yes, but in a different way. She was not to be a ruler in her own right, at least not in the eyes of men, but a piece to be moved on the chessboard of alliances, a pawn that could one day be sacrificed for the sake of the game. From her earliest days, this little girl's life was shaped around one single purpose. To make her marriage useful, her education was carefully selected. She would be taught music, embroidery, courtly manners, and perhaps a touch of literacy if the kingdom was progressive enough. But she was never taught independence, never taught to lead on her own terms. Instead, she was trained to be obedient, to smile sweetly, to bow her head, and to endure. Behind the walls of the castle, her days were not filled with childish play, but with lessons on how to walk gracefully, how to speak in ways that pleased men, and how to hide every trace of her true emotions. Even her body was closely monitored. Was she eating enough? Was she too pale? Was she healthy enough to someday bear children? These questions mattered more to her family than her happiness or dreams. And when she reached the age of 12, 13, or 14, an age we today still consider childhood, she was already spoken of as a bride. Negotiations happened in secret chambers, parchments sealed with wax, alliances forged through her name long before she ever knew the weight of what was coming. The church played its role too. Bishops and priests preached sermons about obedience and duty. A woman, they said, was created to serve her husband, to submit, to bear heirs. The young princess, sitting in a cold cathedral, would hear these words and know that even God's representatives demanded her submission. And so, the foundations of her life were set. Silence, obedience, sacrifice. Our queen, whose tragic story unfolds in this tale, lived precisely this path. She was a child, yet men spoke of her as if she were a treasure chest filled with gold coins, a resource to be given away for the right price. Suitors came not because of her beauty, though she was said to be delicate and fair, but because of her dowry, her lands, her bloodline. She was a prize of war, a trophy of peace, a seal of treaty. But here lies the dark irony of medieval queenship. Though she was meant to be the jewel of alliances, she was also the easiest to discard. If her husband died before she bore a son, her value plummeted. If she failed to conceive, she was whispered about as cursed, sinful, or barren. If her political worth expired, she could be remarried, exiled, or worse, eliminated. From the very start, then, her life was fragile, hanging by the thread of men's ambitions. And when we think of the phrase child bride, it is easy to forget the brutal reality behind it. This was not merely a political inconvenience. This was a child torn from her innocence, placed in the arms of grown men, and told to accept her fate. Her bedchamber became the stage of her duty. Her body, the vessel for dynastic survival. Our queen endured this. She played her role because she had no other choice. And yet, lurking at the edges of her story was a man who saw her not as an ally, nor as a wife, but as a tool for his own ruthless climb to power. He waited, he plotted, he smiled when others were watching, but in the shadows he sharpened his knives, both literal and metaphorical. And as history would later reveal, the child who had been raised to serve, to obey, and to suffer, would one day be handed over to this man. Her fate was not to be a happy marriage, nor a peaceful reign, but a nightmare of betrayal. For the husband she would one day be forced to take was destined to become her executioner. But how did such marriages happen? How could men force a child queen to marry a man she feared, a man she despised, or even a man she knew would harm her? To answer that, we must step deeper into the cruel traditions of medieval marriage contracts, where love was irrelevant, consent was ignored, and vows were chains rather than promises. When we imagine a medieval wedding, it is tempting to picture candlelit chapels, choirs singing hymns, and finely dressed nobles gathered in celebration. But beneath the glitter of jewels and the polished marble floors, the reality of marriage in the Middle Ages was far more sinister, especially for women, and most especially for queens. Marriage was not about love. It was about power, survival, and control. For noble families and monarchs, a daughter's marriage was a transaction, a political currency. Her hand was worth castles, land, soldiers, or treaties. She was traded across borders, the way merchants traded spices or silks. Her body stamped with the invisible seal of diplomacy. Consent, it hardly mattered. The church officially claimed that a marriage was invalid without the bride's agreement. But in practice, the agreement of a girl who was barely 12 or 13 was nothing more than a nod squeezed out under the cold gaze of bishops and lords. If she hesitated, priests would remind her of her duty. If she wept, her tears were dismissed as childish fears. A nod, a whispered yes, or even silence was taken as proof of consent, and so a child's protest could be erased with a priest's blessing. The vows themselves, once spoken, were a trap. Medieval law made it nearly impossible for women to annul or escape a marriage, no matter how horrific it became. Once the words were spoken, she belonged to him, in body, in property, and in fate. If she resisted her husband, she could be accused of sin, rebellion, or even witchcraft. If she obeyed, she might endure years of humiliation, beatings, or forced pregnancies. Either way, the chain was locked tightly around her neck. And for queens, the stakes were even higher. A peasant woman might suffer in obscurity, but a queen's suffering was made public. Her marriage had to serve the realm, and so her private life was never private. Courtiers gossiped about her fertility, whispering about whether she was pregnant or barren. Doctors examined her body for signs of health or weakness, sometimes humiliating her with invasive checks. Priests lectured her about her duty to produce heirs. Every failure was a threat to her safety, every miscarriage a shadow that darkened her future. Our queen's marriage was no exception. She was young, unprepared, and terrified. Yet she was thrust into a union designed not for her happiness, but for the ambitions of men who saw her as a bridge between power and survival. Her wedding feast might have been splendid. Golden goblets filled with wine, platters of roasted swan, dancers and musicians filling the air with joy. But behind her smile lay the knowledge that she was no longer free. Worse still, the man she was bound to was no gentle prince, no noble knight. He was a wolf in human skin, a man whose hands had already been stained with blood, a man who had climbed the ladder of politics through deceit and violence. To the court, he was respectable. A lord, a knight, perhaps even a hero in the eyes of some. But to her, he was a shadow that promised death. What made this union so horrific was not merely that she had no choice, but that everyone around her knew the truth and did nothing. Her family, desperate to secure their own survival, ignored her tears. The church, sworn to protect the innocent, blessed the marriage with holy water and words of God. The court, eager for spectacle, clapped and cheered as vows were exchanged. And so, the girl queen walked hand in hand with her killer, her fate sealed before her eyes ever had the chance to glimpse freedom. In many ways, this was the ultimate betrayal. A queen, supposedly the most exalted woman in the land, was reduced to nothing more than a bargaining chip. Her body was taken, her voice silenced, her future dictated. And the cruelest irony of all, the very institutions that were meant to guard her, the crown, the church, the court, delivered her into the arms of the man who would one day be her executioner. Marriage, for her, was not the start of a fairy tale. It was the beginning of a nightmare. Every smile from her husband was a mask, every tender word a lie. The bed she shared with him was not a place of intimacy, but of conquest, a battlefield where she had no weapon, no shield, no escape. And yet, through all of this, she endured. She was a queen, after all, and she had been raised to hide her pain. She smiled when commanded. She knelt when required. She carried herself with dignity, even as her heart shattered inside. But the cracks in her life were widening. Soon, the man she had been forced to call husband would show his true face, and when he did, the consequences would be catastrophic. For now, the court celebrated, oblivious to the storm on the horizon, but history would remember this marriage not as a triumph, but as a tragedy. The union of queen and killer was a ticking time bomb, and the explosion would be unlike anything the kingdom had ever seen. Imagine waking each morning beside a man you knew would one day be your killer. His face is the first thing you see, his breath the first thing you smell, his hand the first touch that greets you, and yet you must smile. You must bow your head and act the obedient wife, even as your heart pounds with dread. This was the daily reality for our young medieval queen. Marriage had not brought her security, nor companionship, nor even respect. It had brought her into the lair of a predator. Her husband was no ordinary man. He was a figure both admired and feared at court, admired for his ruthlessness in battle, feared for his temper in private. He was a man who carried cruelty in his very bones. When servants displeased him, he struck them without hesitation. When rivals crossed him, they vanished into dungeons, never to return. His laughter was cold, his eyes sharp as a blade, and the queen, his wife, became his most fragile prisoner. Her daily life was a prison without bars. The palace was vast and filled with splendor, marble halls, gilded chambers, feasts overflowing with delicacies. But every corner of it echoed with her fear. At the banquet table, she smiled as goblets clinked and lords toasted. But she ate little, always wondering if her wine had been poisoned. In the royal chambers, she lay stiff in bed as her husband demanded her submission, knowing that refusal could bring punishment. Even her prayers in the chapel were haunted, for she feared God had abandoned her to this fate. The cruelty of living beside death was that it was slow. Her husband did not strike her down in a single moment. No, he toyed with her. One day he would flatter her, presenting jewels and whispering words of false devotion. The next, he would humiliate her before courtiers, mocking her youth, her inexperience, or her inability to produce an heir. This cycle of kindness and cruelty broke her spirit piece by piece, leaving her constantly off balance, never knowing what awaited her behind the next door. Even her body became a battleground. Medieval queens were expected to produce heirs, and the pressure weighed heavily on her. Each month that passed without a pregnancy was a fresh wound to her reputation. Servants whispered, courtiers exchanged knowing glances. Was she barren? Or worse, was she cursed? Every miscarriage, every failed attempt at carrying a child to term, was another reason for her husband to despise her. And in the brutal logic of medieval courts, a queen who could not give birth was a queen who could easily be discarded. But discarding her would not be enough. Her husband's ambitions were darker. He had clawed his way to power not through mercy, but through bloodshed, and he had no intention of allowing her a quiet escape. He viewed her as both useful and disposable, a pawn who could legitimize his claim to the throne, but also a liability if she ever turned against him. In his twisted mind, the solution was simple. She would serve him until she was no longer needed, and then she would die. This unspoken truth hung over her like a guillotine. She sensed it in the way he stared at her sometimes, not with affection, but with calculation. She heard it in the rumors whispered through palace corridors, rumors of men who had crossed him, men who had been executed without trial, men whose bodies had been found floating in rivers. She knew she was no exception, and yet she could not run. A queen could not flee her husband without igniting scandal, rebellion, or war. Her family had abandoned her to this fate. Her church demanded her obedience, and her crown chained her in place. She was trapped in a gilded cage, forced to perform her role as dutiful wife, even as terror gnawed at her soul. It is easy, centuries later, to wonder why she did not resist, why she did not plot, escape, or revenge. But in the medieval world, a queen had fewer choices than a commoner. Every move she made was watched, every word she spoke recorded. One slip, one wrong step, and she could be accused of treason, infidelity, or witchcraft. Charges that carried death sentences of their own, so she endured. She played the part of the queen, even as she lived every day with the grim certainty that her life would end at the hands of the man she called husband. Each sunrise was another day of survival. Each sunset was a small victory. But fate has a cruel way of tightening its grip. The cracks in her marriage widened. The whispers at court grew louder. And soon, the unthinkable would happen. Her husband would set in motion the very plan that would seal her doom. The court was a stage, and every glance, every whisper, every smirk carried weight. For our young queen, this theater of politics was no less dangerous than the iron chains of a dungeon. She was not merely a wife, she was a symbol, a vessel of power, and for that reason, every noble in the kingdom had their eyes upon her. At first, the whispers were subtle. Murmurs among the ladies-in-waiting that the queen looked pale, that her eyes carried the red stain of sleepless nights. Servants noticed the way she flinched at her husband's footsteps, or how she sometimes lingered too long at the chapel, clutching her rosary until her knuckles whitened. Nobles noticed too, for nobles always noticed weakness. And weakness, in a medieval court, was blood in the water. Her husband's cruelty was not always private. Sometimes, he unleashed his venom before the entire court. At feasts, he mocked her in cutting tones, drawing laughter from sycophants eager to prove their loyalty. A crown sits heavy on a child's head, he once sneered, as she sat silently beside him, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Another time, when she spilled a cup of wine in her trembling hands, he slapped her across the face in front of bishops and barons. No one dared protest. Instead, they lowered their eyes, some smirking, others grim with pity. The cruelty served a purpose. It reminded everyone who held the true power. But it also stoked rumors. Was the queen unfit to rule? Was she cursed by God? Or worse, was she secretly plotting revenge against the man who tormented her? In the medieval world, rumor was as deadly as the sword. A whisper could become an accusation, a trial, and a trial, an execution. For women, even queens, the threat was ever present. She knew that her enemies at court, whether loyal to rival families or jealous of her fragile beauty, would seize upon any weakness. A single mistake could lead to charges of adultery, witchcraft, or treason. And treason, in those days, meant a death most gruesome. It was not long before these whispers reached her husband's ears. Men, loyal to him, eager to curry favor, reported every stray comment, every nervous glance. They suggested that the queen had begun speaking privately with certain knights, men whose loyalty was questionable. They insinuated that she prayed too often, that her eyes lingered on other men. Perhaps she was unfaithful. Perhaps she was conspiring. Whether the rumors were true did not matter. In a medieval court, truth was irrelevant. What mattered was perception. And her husband needed little excuse to tighten the noose. Behind the thick stone walls of the palace, he began to plot. He had always intended to rid himself of her one day, but now the whispers of treason gave him justification. A wife could be cast aside quietly, but a traitor could be destroyed publicly, with fire and blood, and no one would dare question it. The queen felt the air shift long before the trap was sprung. Courtiers, who once bowed deeply, now offered her shallow nods. Her ladies-in-waiting grew distant, their loyalty shifting toward the king. Guards watched her with cold suspicion. Even the chaplain who heard her confessions gave her sharp looks, as though her prayers were laced with secrets. She began to sense she was surrounded not by servants and allies, but by spies. Every word she spoke might be twisted, every gesture misinterpreted. Fear became her constant companion. She ate less, for fear of poison. She slept lightly, waking at the creak of a door. Her youth was withering before its time, and she seemed more like a ghost wandering palace halls than a queen upon a throne. And yet, somewhere within her, a spark of resistance remained. Though she trembled at her husband's cruelty, though she felt the eyes of traitors upon her, she clung to life with desperate strength. She wrote secret letters to her family, begging for aid. She whispered prayers to saints long forgotten, asking for deliverance. She dreamed of escape, of fleeing the palace, of disguising herself as a peasant, of slipping away into the countryside. But dreams could not match reality. A queen could not vanish without consequence. She was too visible, too important, and more than that, she was watched at every hour. Escape was impossible. The walls of the palace seemed to close in tighter each day. The great tapestries and golden candlesticks mocked her, reminders of her gilded prison, and always at the heart of it all, her husband loomed like a shadow. His cruelty grew sharper, his glares colder. He no longer needed to hide his hatred. To him, the queen was already dead. She just had not yet been executed. And soon, the court itself would witness her downfall. Plans were already being whispered in chambers lit by flickering torchlight. The king's men would spread rumors of treason louder, until they reached a crescendo impossible to ignore. When the time came, he would not only rid himself of his wife, he would make an example of her. Her fate, once sealed in marriage, now edged closer with every passing day. The storm that had long been brewing finally broke. One cold morning, the queen was summoned to the great hall. The stone chamber was filled with nobles, bishops, and guards, all gathered under the pretense of justice. But there was no justice here. This was a spectacle, carefully orchestrated, designed to humiliate, to break, and to destroy. Her husband sat at the head of the hall, draped in velvet and furs, his crown glinting in the candlelight. Around him stood lords eager to prove their loyalty, clerics ready to sanctify the proceedings, and soldiers prepared to enforce his will. The queen, though robed in silk, looked small in comparison. Her pale face, framed by a golden headdress, revealed both fear and defiance. She was a lamb led to slaughter, but a lamb with the eyes of someone who still clung desperately to life. The accusations were read aloud in solemn tones: treason, adultery, and consorting with enemies of the realm. The charges, though vague, carried weight in a medieval court. A queen accused of adultery was not merely unfaithful. She was a threat to dynastic legitimacy. If she had lain with another man, then the bloodline of kings itself could be tainted. Treason, meanwhile, was the most unforgivable of all crimes, and unlike today, evidence was not required. A word, a rumor, even a dream could be twisted into proof. The court erupted in murmurs. Some nobles crossed themselves, others smirked, knowing that her fate had been sealed long before the trial began. The queen's protestations, soft, trembling, yet unwavering, fell on deaf ears. She insisted upon her innocence, swore upon the saints and relics that she had never betrayed her vows, never raised her hand against the king. But in truth, her words were meaningless. In the medieval world, trials were not about truth, they were about power, and power belonged to her husband. Her so-called defenders were silent, intimidated into compliance. Bishops declared that God himself had guided the charges, and that to question them was to question divine will. Some even whispered that her misfortunes, her sickly complexion, her barren womb, were signs of God's disfavor. What better proof of her guilt than heaven itself turning against her? As the accusations piled higher, her mind drifted to stories she had heard as a child. Tales of other women, queens, and noblewomen alike, who had met similar fates. Some had been dragged through streets on carts, jeered at by mobs. Others had been stripped of titles, their names erased, their bodies broken. She realized she was not unique. She was part of a pattern, a long history of women used, discarded, and destroyed by the same brutal system. The trial itself was little more than theater, but its outcome would be devastatingly real. Once condemned, a queen could face a multitude of horrors. Perhaps she would be burned alive, the flames consuming her body as the crowd cheered. Perhaps she would be drowned, her delicate frame tied to stones and lowered into dark waters. Or perhaps most humiliating of all, she would be forced to kneel before the executioner, the very man she had once been bound to in marriage. As she stood in the center of the hall, listening to the venom poured upon her name, she thought of her family. She thought of her parents, who had once dreamed that her marriage would unite kingdoms. She thought of her childhood, of simpler days when she had laughed in gardens, when her hair had caught the sunlight, when she had not yet known the suffocating weight of a crown. She thought of her future, or rather, the lack of it. And yet, despite her terror, she did not collapse. She held her head high, her eyes glistening with tears but steady with defiance. If she was to be condemned, she would not give her enemies the satisfaction of watching her beg. She would walk to her doom with dignity, even if her heart trembled within her chest. At the end of the day, the verdict was delivered. Predictably, inevitably, guilty. The crowd murmured, some in pity, others in satisfaction. Her husband leaned back in his chair, his lips curled into the faintest smile. For him, this was victory. He had broken his enemy not on the battlefield, but in the court of public shame. But the queen's suffering was not yet complete. The trial was only the beginning. The sentence, the punishment, would be far worse. For in the medieval world, executions were not only about death, they were about display. The death of a queen had to be spectacular, symbolic, unforgettable. She was led away in silence, her wrists bound with silk cords. Outside the great hall, the cold wind bit at her cheeks. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear church bells tolling, a sound that, to her ears, rang like a funeral dirge. Her fate had been sealed. Now, all that remained was the execution. The morning of her execution dawned gray and bitter, as though the heavens themselves recoiled at what was about to take place. The queen had spent the night in a cold stone chamber. Her bed, nothing more than straw, her body wrapped in a coarse woolen cloak that smelled of mildew. She had barely slept, not out of fear alone, but from the knowledge that the world as she had known it would vanish with the rising of the sun. Outside the prison walls, preparations were already underway. In medieval society, executions were not private affairs. They were public theater. The killing of a queen demanded even more spectacle, for it was not only the death of a woman, but the shattering of an institution. The townsfolk whispered excitedly in the streets, gathering in anticipation as though for a festival. Bakers closed their shops. Blacksmiths set aside their hammers. Children climbed onto barrels for a better view. For many, this was the only chance they would ever have to see royalty so near, and to watch her humbled in death. At dawn, the queen was led from her cell. Her garments had been stripped of all ornamentation. No crown, no jewels, no golden embroidery, just a plain white gown that clung to her thin frame. White, the color of innocence, had been twisted into the color of condemnation. Her long hair, once groomed with oils and perfumes, now fell loose about her shoulders, uncombed and heavy with grief. She was barefoot, her delicate feet raw against the frozen earth. 2 guards flanked her as she walked through the corridors of the fortress. Their footsteps echoed like a funeral drumbeat. Behind them trailed the executioner, his hood concealing his face. But what made the queen's blood run cold was the whispered knowledge that this man, this silent figure, was no stranger. He was the one she had been forced to wed, the very man who, in a twisted ceremony of humiliation, had been bound to her as husband, was now appointed as her killer. The symbolism was clear. Her death was to be the ultimate union of power and punishment. A grotesque marriage where vows were sealed not by love, but by blood. As the queen stepped outside, the roar of the crowd struck her like a physical blow. Thousands had gathered in the square, packed shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising in misty clouds. Some jeered and spat, calling her adulteress, traitor, whore. Others, especially women, looked on with pity, their eyes wet with silent tears. A few brave souls crossed themselves and prayed softly, hoping that God would show mercy where men would not. At the center of the square stood the scaffold. Its wooden platform was freshly built, the timber still smelling of pine, though dark stains hinted at its grim purpose. Upon it rested a block, worn smooth by countless heads that had lain upon it before. An axe gleamed beside it, its blade sharpened to a cruel edge. The queen was led up the creaking steps. Each footfall sounded final, like nails hammered into her coffin. On the platform, the herald read aloud her crimes once more, his voice booming over the hushed crowd. Treason, adultery, betrayal. Each word rang like a death knell, stripping her not only of life but of honor, ensuring that history itself would remember her as fallen, disgraced. And yet, in that moment, the queen revealed her greatest strength. She stepped forward with composure, her chin lifted high, her voice clear despite the trembling within her. "I die innocent," she declared, her words carrying across the square. "I have wronged no man. God knows the truth, though the world does not. I forgive those who condemn me, and I pray that heaven forgives them in turn." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some wept, others scoffed, but none could deny the dignity with which she faced her doom. Finally, the executioner approached. His figure loomed, silent, his axe in hand. But as he stood before her, she looked directly into his eyes. In that instant, recognition passed between them. He was not merely her killer, he was her husband in name, the man forced into the grotesque role of both spouse and slayer. The irony was almost unbearable. A queen, once married for alliance, now wedded again in death to the very blade that would sever her from the world. Kneeling, she placed her neck upon the block. The wood was cold against her skin. The world suddenly still. She closed her eyes, whispered a final prayer, and waited. The executioner raised his axe high into the air. For a breathless moment, the crowd held its breath. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Men leaned forward. Women turned away. The silence was suffocating. Then the blade fell. A single, swift strike, followed by a gasp that rippled through the throng. Her body collapsed forward, her golden hair spilling like a veil across the block, her lifeless form illuminated by the pale morning light. The executioner lifted the head high for all to see, as was custom. The grim proof that justice, as the court defined it, had been served. The square erupted in sound. Some cheered, others sobbed. Priests chanted, guards shouted for order. But amid the chaos, the truth remained. A queen had been silenced forever, not by fate, but by the cruelty of men. And yet, even in death, her story was not over. For whispers of her dignity, her innocence, her tragic end would spread across kingdoms. Songs would be sung, tales would be told, and her execution meant to erase her would instead immortalize her as a symbol of suffering, of injustice, and of the merciless grip of medieval power. The scaffold was torn down within days, its planks scattered, its bloodstains scrubbed away, as though the memory of her execution could be erased with a few strokes of a brush. But blood leaves a deeper stain than wood or stone. It seeps into the minds of those who witness it, and from there, into the stories that are told and retold. Though the crown declared her a criminal, the people who had seen her final moments carried away a different tale. Many whispered that the queen had gone to her death with more courage than any king they had ever seen. She had stood unflinching before the axe, her voice steady, her words defiant. In a society where women were meant to be silent, submissive, and obedient, she had chosen her last breath to proclaim innocence and faith. That act alone set her apart, transforming her from a disgraced wife into a figure of tragic martyrdom. But medieval power was built on control of narrative. The royal court, eager to justify the queen's death, began to circulate its own story. Chroniclers in service to the crown described her as a temptress, a betrayer, a woman whose sins had brought ruin upon her realm. They painted her execution not as cruelty, but as necessity, the righteous cleansing of corruption. Her forced marriage to the executioner, they argued, was symbolic justice, a fallen queen wedded to death itself. And yet, truth is never so easy to control. Among common folk, her story spread in a different form. Pilgrims whispered her name on lonely roads. Minstrels wove her tragedy into mournful ballads. Even in hushed voices, mothers told their daughters of the queen. Some began to call her the White Bride of Death, a name born from her plain white gown and the grim marriage forced upon her in her final days. Rumors soon took root. Strange, haunting tales that blurred the line between fact and myth. Some claimed that on the night of her death, a pale figure in white was seen wandering the castle halls, her hair flowing like a golden river, her hands clasped as if still in prayer. Others swore that the executioner himself was cursed, that though he had struck her down, he could never sleep without hearing her voice, whispering forgiveness into his ear, forgiveness that felt more like a wound than a bomb. The image of the queen's severed head, held aloft before the crowd, became etched in memory. But so too did the moment before it fell, her words, her grace, her defiance. In villages far from the seat of power, people began to tell a different version of events, that she had been innocent, framed by scheming nobles, sacrificed to preserve the pride of kings. Some went so far as to claim that God himself had marked her as holy, and that miracles occurred near the site of her grave. And yet, her grave itself was an afterthought. Unlike kings who were laid to rest in gilded tombs beneath soaring cathedrals, her body was quietly interred in consecrated ground, the location unmarked. This anonymity was deliberate. The court feared her memory might inspire rebellion, that her grave could become a shrine. But anonymity could not silence her. It only deepened the mystery, feeding legends of a queen who would not die. Centuries later, chroniclers still debated her. Was she guilty of the sins for which she was condemned? Or was she the victim of politics, a pawn crushed beneath the weight of dynastic ambition? The absence of certainty allowed her story to grow in the shadows of history, reshaped again and again by those who told it. And herein lies the chilling truth. Her death was not just an execution, it was a warning, a spectacle designed to teach both nobles and commoners alike. The price of betrayal, whether real or imagined, her forced marriage to her executioner was no accident of cruelty. It was a symbol, crafted with precision, meant to show that even queens could be humbled, broken, owned. Yet the very act meant to erase her had the opposite effect. Instead of disappearing into obscurity, she became immortalized as a ghostly presence. A tragic queen whose blood cried out across centuries. She embodied the terror of power abused and the resilience of dignity maintained, even in the face of death. In the end, she was both victim and victor. Victim of a brutal system that consumed lives in the name of order, but victor in the sense that her story endured far beyond her killers. Long after the names of the men who condemned her faded into dust, hers continued to be spoken, mourned, sung. And so the queen who was forced to wed her killer became more than a figure in history. She became a symbol of all the women silenced in the medieval world, of all those whose lives were dictated by politics, by power, by the merciless laws of men. Her body may have perished on the scaffold, but her memory, that could not be killed,